I am Norman, 71 years old, and somehow still breathing after my own flesh and blood tried to break me. As a retired farmer, I worked the land my entire life to provide for them. Last Sunday, my two children cornered me in my own kitchen. Between screaming about her failing boutique and demanding a $1.2 million wire transfer, my son Jacob shoved me so hard against my solid oak table that I heard my rib crack. I simply caught my breath, pulled out my phone, and smiled. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who saw you as nothing more than a walking ATM. The kitchen smelled of stale coffee and impending ruin. It was a Sunday afternoon, the kind of day that used to be reserved for family dinners, the smell of roasted chicken and quiet moments on the porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon. But today the air in the farmhouse was thick with greed and hostility. This house, the very walls that had protected them since they were children, was now the stage for their ultimate betrayal. Natalie, my youngest, was pacing the worn linoleum floor like a caged animal. Her expensive designer heels clicked frantically, a stark contrast to the modest surroundings of my home. She was screaming, her voice shrill and desperate, complaining that her high-end boutique in the city was going under. She waved her manicured hands in the air, going on about inventory shortages, aggressive creditors, and lease agreements she could no longer afford. She was demanding her share right now, acting as if her poor business choices and reckless spending were my emergencies to fix. She spoke of my money as if it were already sitting in her bank account, completely ignoring the decades of sweat and sacrifice it took to build that wealth. Standing opposite her, casting a long shadow over the kitchen island, was Jacob, my firstborn son. At 42 years old, he still possessed the demanding posture of a spoiled child who had never been told no. He was leaning heavily over this counter, his face flushed red with an ugly mixture of anger and entitlement. He was demanding the $1.2 million wire transfer from the recent sale of the farm. He did not ask politely. He did not suggest a loan. He demanded the funds, pounding his fist on the countertop, insisting that the money was practically his anyway, and that I was just being a stubborn old fool, hoarding cash I did not need for my twilight years. He needed that money desperately, and I knew exactly why. I knew about his hidden debts, the lavish lifestyle he could not afford, and the walls closing in on him. I sat there in my worn armchair. The same chair I had rested my aching bones in after decades of 12-hour days in the blistering sun. I looked at the two people I had raised, the two people whose lives of comfort had been funded entirely by the dirt under my fingernails and the calluses on my hands. They did not see a father sitting before them. They saw a bank vault standing between them and their salvation. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the heavy silence stretch for a moment. Then I looked Jacob dead in the eye, and with a calm, unwavering voice, I said a single word: no. The silence that immediately followed was absolute and suffocating. It was as if all the oxygen had been violently sucked out of the room. Natalie stopped pacing mid-step, her mouth hanging open. Jacob stared at me, his eyes wide with a mixture of disbelief and pure, unadulterated panic. The word no was entirely foreign to them. For years, they had been shielded from consequence, given whatever they needed whenever they asked. But today, the bank was officially closed, and then the panic took over. He snapped. Jacob lunged forward with terrifying speed. Before I could even raise my hands to defend myself, he shoved me. It was not a light push or a simple physical outburst. It was a violent, desperate shove fueled by pure rage and the terror of a man whose financial house of cards was collapsing. My boots slipped on the polished linoleum floor, and I flew backward. My body slammed violently against the thick, unforgiving edge of the heavy oak dining table. The impact was brutal. A sickening loud crack echoed through the kitchen, cutting sharply through the heavy silence. It was a sound I will never forget. White-hot pain shot up my right side, stealing my breath instantly. The agony radiated through my chest, forcing me to collapse onto the floor. I lay there, curled on the linoleum, clutching my ribs, gasping for air that felt like broken glass entering my lungs. Jacob stumbled back, looking at his own hands, as if they belonged to a monster, his chest heaving. Natalie let out a choked, high-pitched gasp, covering her mouth in sheer terror as she backed away toward the hallway. They both froze, completely paralyzed, staring at me crumpled on the floor. They expected me to scream in agony. They expected me to beg for help, to cry out for them, or to desperately crawl toward the landline to dial emergency services. They expected the frail old man they thought I had become to surrender to their dominance, but I did not scream. I did not shed a single tear, nor did I cry out for mercy. Despite the blinding, agonizing pain radiating through my chest with every shallow breath I took, my mind had never been sharper or clearer. The physical blow had shattered any remaining illusion I had about my family. Slowly, deliberately ignoring the searing pain in my side, I reached into the front pocket of my trousers. My fingers closed around the cool metal of my smartphone. I pulled it out, completely ignoring their panicked, wide-eyed stares. I opened my messages. I had a text already drafted to my lawyer. Neil prepared hours ago when I first suspected this confrontation was going to turn ugly. The message simply gave him the green light to initiate the final phase of my plan. With a steady thumb, I hit send. Then I slowly looked up at my children. I pushed myself up slightly, leaning my battered body against the cold wood of the lower kitchen cabinets. I locked eyes with Jacob, then with Natalie, and I whispered the only words they needed to hear. "You just lost everything." 3 weeks before, that agonizing crack in my kitchen echoed through the house. The sky over the farm was a brilliant, indifferent blue. It was a Tuesday, the day the sale officially closed. For 40 years, that land was my entire world. 200 acres of rich, unforgiving soil that demanded every ounce of strength I had to give. I poured my youth into those fields. I gave them my sweat, my back, and my sleepless nights. I knew the smell of the impending rain before the clouds even formed. I knew which tractor gears stuck in the cold. Every wooden fence post, every rusted nail held a piece of my history. It was not just dirt and crop. It was my legacy. It was the place that put food on our table, paid for braces, and funded college degrees. Signing the final papers that morning felt like cutting off a limb. It was a heavy, mournful silence that settled over me as I sat on the front porch, nursing a cup of black coffee. I expected to feel a sense of relief, a lifting of the burden of manual labor. Instead, I just felt a profound emptiness. I was saying goodbye to the only life I had ever known. I thought my children would understand that weight. I thought they would come out to the farm, sit with me on the old wooden steps, and share a quiet moment of reflection. I thought they might walk the fields one last time, remembering the summers they spent catching fireflies by the creek, or helping me harvest before the first frost. I was incredibly naive. The sound of tires crushing the gravel driveway broke my quiet morning. Jacob arrived first, driving a sleek leased sports car that looked completely ridiculous, covered in farm dust. Natalie pulled in right behind him in a luxury SUV she absolutely could not afford. They did not park near the barn where we used to play basketball. They parked as close to the front door as possible, as if the very soil of the farm might infect their designer shoes. I watched them step out of their vehicles. They did not look out over the acres of land that had shaped their childhoods. They did not take a deep breath of the fresh open air. Their eyes were glued to their expensive smartphones, their thumbs tapping frantically. They walked up the porch steps with a hurried, nervous energy. They did not look at me like a father who had just closed a massive chapter of his life. They looked at me like a teller behind a bank window. Jacob did not ask how I was doing. He did not ask how it felt to sign the farm away. His very first words, as he reached the top step, were a demand for logistical data. "Did the lawyer call you yet? Did the buyer sign the final addendum? Is the money in escrow?" Natalie brushed past him, pushing through the screen door into the kitchen. She did not even say hello. She just started peppering me with questions about banking protocols. How long does a wire transfer of that size take to clear? Did they say 24 hours or 48 hours? I have vendors breathing down my neck for the boutique. Dad, I need a timeline. I stayed in my chair on the porch for a long moment, gripping my coffee mug so tightly my knuckles turned white. I listened to their voices carrying through the screen door. They were buzzing with a frantic, greedy electricity. I finally stood up, my knees aching, and walked inside. My kitchen, the heart of our family home, had been transformed instantly into a corporate waiting room. Jacob was pacing back and forth, loosening his expensive silk tie. Natalie was leaning against the counter, scrolling through her banking app, her face tight with impatience. They were practically vibrating with anticipation, completely oblivious to the man standing quietly in the doorway. I just watched them. I did not raise my voice. I did not demand respect. I simply observed them with a newfound, terrifying clarity. For decades, I had worked myself to the bone, believing I was building a foundation for my family. I believed I was providing security. But looking at them right then, I realized I had not raised grateful children. I had raised vultures. They were circling the carcass of my life's work, waiting for the exact moment they could tear off their piece. They continued talking, completely ignoring the fact that the money they were salivating over belonged to me. Jacob began complaining about the interest rates on a luxury condominium downtown. He said the seller was threatening to accept another offer if he did not produce the down payment by Friday. He spoke about the $1 million farm sale as if it were a joint venture, as if he had somehow earned that money right alongside me. He said things like, when our funds clear and once we get our hands on the cash. Natalie chimed in, agreeing with him. She talked about a massive inventory order for her failing clothing boutique. She needed a 6-figure injection. Immediately, she claimed to rebrand her store. She spoke about my money as a necessary bailout for her own terrible business decisions. They were dividing up my life savings right in front of my face. I stood silently by the refrigerator, feeling a cold knot form in the pit of my stomach. I remembered Jacob as a little boy sitting on my lap while I drove the tractor, looking up at me with wide, admiring eyes. I remembered Natalie as a little girl running through the tall grass with dirt on her knees, laughing until she could not breathe. Where did those children go? When did they turn into these strangers in expensive suits, measuring my worth entirely by the balance of my checking account? I realized then that they felt absolutely zero emotional connection to the farm. To them, the sweat soaking my shirts, the calluses tearing open on my hands, the years I spent waking up at 4 a.m. in freezing weather, none of it mattered. The land was just a giant lottery ticket, and they were furious that the payout was taking so long to print. Dad, are you even listening to us? Jacob snapped, breaking my train of thought. He looked at me with deep irritation. I need to know if I should call my real estate broker and ask for an extension on the condo. Will the bank clear the money by tomorrow morning or not? I looked at my son. I looked at the impatience in his eyes. I looked at Natalie, who was glaring at me as if my silence was a personal insult to her schedule. I realized that arguing with them would be completely pointless. Explaining the emotional significance of the day would be like speaking a foreign language they refused to learn. They were blind to everything except the dollar signs dancing in their heads. I took a slow breath, letting the reality of the situation wash over me. The disrespect was not loud. It was not a screaming match. It was a simmering, quiet arrogance. It was the absolute assumption that my money was their money and my feelings were irrelevant. They saw my entire existence, my decades of labor, simply as their ultimate payday. Yes, Jacob, I finally said, my voice steady and completely devoid of emotion. The lawyer called. The paperwork is finalized. Natalie let out a loud, dramatic sigh of relief, leaning her head back against the cabinets. Thank God, she muttered. I thought this nightmare was going to drag on into next week. This nightmare. That is what she called the sale of the farm. The sale of the home that sheltered her, the land that fed her. It was just a bureaucratic nightmare, delaying her shopping spree. I nodded slowly, keeping my face perfectly blank. I walked past them, rinsed my coffee mug in the sink, and set it on the drying rack. I did not tell them that the money would not be hitting my personal checking account in the way they expected. I did not tell them that my eyes were finally open to their true nature. I simply let them bask in their greedy anticipation, knowing full well that the lesson they were about to learn would change the trajectory of their lives forever. I stayed quiet and I began to plan. The air in the kitchen was thick and suffocating. Natalie pushed off the counter and stepped toward me, her designer shoes clicking sharply against the worn linoleum. She did not ask how I felt about leaving the land. She just looked at me with cold calculation. "Dad," she said, her voice dropping into a tone she used when she wanted to sound professional. "I need $100,000 transferred by Friday. Consider it an advance on my inheritance. My boutique is facing a cash flow crisis, and I need to restructure my debt." An advance on her inheritance. The words hung in the room like a foul odor. She was looking at me, a living and breathing man, and asking for death benefits. I sat in my chair and looked at her expensive handbag sitting on my battered kitchen table. I thought about the thousands of hours I spent driving a combine in the sweltering heat just to put shoes on her feet. I looked at Jacob, who was nodding along with her request, clearly waiting for his turn to ask for a handout. I shook my head slowly. "No, Natalie. I will not be giving you $100,000. She blinked. It was a slow and confused blink, as if I had spoken to her in a foreign language. "Excuse me," she said, her voice rising an octave. I kept my voice calm and steady. I said, "No. You have run that boutique into the ground for 3 years. You buy inventory, you cannot sell, you lease a storefront, you cannot afford, and you take vacations while your employees run the register. Giving you that money is not an investment. It is throwing $100,000 into a fire." Natalie's face turned a violent shade of red. Her professional facade crumbled instantly. "You have $1 million sitting in a bank account," she yelled, pointing a manicured finger at my chest. "You are an old man living in a farmhouse. What are you even going to do with it? Buy a new tractor. You do not even own dirt anymore. I need that money to save my livelihood." Jacob stepped in, playing the peacemaker, but only protecting his own interests. "Come on, Dad. Just help her out. It is a drop in the bucket now. You have plenty to go around." I stood up. My knees popped a dull ache, reminding me of my age. "That money is my retirement," I said. "It is the sum total of 40 years of manual labor. It is not a slush fund to bail you out of your own financial incompetence." Natalie slammed her hands on the counter. "Mom would have given it to me." The room went completely silent. The mention of my late wife hit me like a physical blow. Natalie stood there, her chest heaving, her eyes full of venom. "Mom never would have let me drown like this," Natalie screamed, tears of pure rage pooling in her eyes. "Mom understood how hard it is out there. She always helped us when things got tight. She never hoarded her money like a selfish miser." I stared at my daughter. The air in the kitchen felt suddenly thin. "Mom would have given it." Those words echoed in my mind over and over, unlocking doors to memories I had kept tightly shut for years. When my wife was alive, I worked from dawn until dusk. I was in the fields before the sun came up, and I was in the barn repairing equipment long after it went down. My wife handled the checkbook. She paid the bills. She managed the household finances. I trusted her implicitly. But there were always things that did not quite add up. I remembered the time Jacob wrecked his first car. He was 19 and driving recklessly. I told him he would have to take the bus and work a minimum wage job to pay for the repairs. But 2 weeks later, a new car magically appeared in the driveway. My wife told me she had managed to negotiate an incredible insurance payout. I remembered when Natalie went to college and maxed out 3 credit cards in her first semester. I told my wife we needed to cut Natalie off, and make her learn the value of a dollar. My wife agreed with me to my face, but somehow Natalie never got a job, and she never missed a sorority trip. Standing in the kitchen looking at the furious and entitled adults my children had become, the devastating truth washed over me. My wife had been secretly funneling our savings to them for decades. While I was out breaking my back in the dirt to build a secure future, she was indoors, quietly paying off their mistakes. She had shielded them from every consequence, every failure, and every financial reality. She thought she was being a loving mother. She thought she was protecting her babies. But she was not protecting them. She was crippling them. She had built a wall of cash between them and the real world. Every time they fell, she slipped a check under the table to cushion the blow. And because I was too exhausted, too blind, and too busy working the land to notice the discrepancies in the bank statements, I allowed it to happen. The ghost of my wife's enablement was standing right in front of me, manifesting in the arrogant and demanding posture of my children. I looked at Natalie. I saw the absolute conviction in her eyes that she deserved my money simply because she existed. I looked at Jacob, who was nodding in agreement with his sister, fully believing that my life savings was a family pot of gold meant to cover their bad decisions. The rot did not start today. The rot had been growing for years, hidden beneath the floorboards of our family. My wife had planted the seeds of this entitlement, watering it with secret bailouts and hidden transfers. And now the harvest was here. They did not respect me because they never had to respect the money I earned. To them, my labor was invisible. The money was just a magical resource that their mother dispensed whenever they whined loud enough. And now that their mother was gone, they expected the magical dispenser to keep functioning. They expected me to simply take over her role as the silent and compliant bank. A deep, profound sadness settled over my heart. I was not just mourning the loss of the farm anymore. I was mourning the loss of the children I thought I had raised. I had spent 40 years trying to cultivate a legacy of hard work and integrity, but my own home had been a greenhouse for greed. I looked at Natalie. Her face was still twisted in anger, waiting for me to break, waiting for the mention of her dead mother to manipulate me into writing a check. "Your mother is not here," I said softly. My voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried through the kitchen with absolute finality. "Your mother is not here to save you from your own failures anymore, and neither am I." Natalie scoffed, crossing her arms over her chest. "You are unbelievable. You are actually going to let my business fail." "I am going to let you face the real world," I replied. Jacob stepped forward, his face darkening. "Dad, you are making a massive mistake. You do not treat family this way. You are going to need us when you get older, and you are burning bridges over a fraction of what you just made." I looked at my son, seeing the veiled threat in his words. The manipulation was so practiced, so natural to them. They were trying to leverage my future vulnerability against my present wealth. "There are no bridges left to burn," I told them both. "You burned them the moment you walked through my door and asked for a payout instead of asking how I was doing." I turned my back on them and walked toward the hallway. The conversation was over. The illusion was shattered. I left them standing in the kitchen, their angry murmurs echoing behind me. As I walked down the hall, the pain in my heart was heavy, but my mind was incredibly clear. The ghost of enablement had haunted this family for far too long. It was time to exorcise it, no matter how much it hurt. I walked away from the kitchen, leaving the echo of my refusal hanging in the heavy air. I hoped the silence of the living room would calm the rapid beating of my heart. I thought the confrontation had reached its end. I expected to hear the heavy front door slam shut, followed by the crunch of gravel as they drove their expensive cars back to the city. But the house remained suffocatingly still. Footsteps sounded behind me. Heavy, deliberate steps. Jacob had followed me into the living room. When I turned around, I saw he was clutching a sleek black leather folder. He must have retrieved it from his sports car while I was reeling from the argument with Natalie. His face had completely transformed. The furious red, flushed anger from the kitchen was gone, replaced by a forced, sickeningly polite smile. It was the exact expression of a desperate salesman who knew he was losing the pitch, but had absolutely no choice but to close the deal. I invited himself to sit on the edge of my faded floral sofa, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. He patted the leather folder, treating it as if it held the secrets to the universe. He spoke in a low, measured voice, attempting to sound reasonable and mature. He told me he understood my frustration with Natalie. He agreed that her boutique was a black hole for cash. Then, without missing a beat, he smoothly pivoted to his own agenda. Jacob opened the folder and spread several glossy, high-quality brochures across my coffee table. The pages displayed a spectacular, ultra-modern penthouse condominium located right in the financial district of the city. There were photos of floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the skyline, imported marble kitchen islands, and private rooftop terraces. It was a palace in the sky, a monument to wealth and excess. He began his pitch. He talked about how real estate was the only secure place to park cash these days. He spun a beautiful narrative about how this condo was not just for him, but an investment for the entire family. He even had the audacity to suggest that it would be a comfortable place for me to visit when I grew tired of the quiet country life. I sat in my armchair, staring at the glossy pages, and I waited for the catch. I knew my son. I knew he was not showing me real estate brochures just to chat about investment strategies. The catch arrived wrapped in a layer of arrogant presumption that made my stomach turn. Jacob cleared his throat, adjusting his expensive watch. He casually mentioned that the housing market was incredibly competitive right now. He said a property like this would not stay listed for more than a few days. So to secure the investment, he had already taken the liberty of signing a preliminary contract. He had put down a non-refundable deposit of $75,000. I stared at him, my mind struggling to process the sheer magnitude of his entitlement. He had drained his own savings and maxed out his credit lines to scrape together that deposit, doing it all weeks before my farm even officially sold. He had gambled $75,000 of his own money because he was absolutely certain he would be getting a massive cut of mine the very second the ink dried on my sale. But that was not the end of his problem. The bank was refusing to underwrite the final mortgage. Jacob had hidden his massive debts well, but the financial underwriters saw right through his flashy suits and leased cars. His debt-to-income ratio was a disaster. The lender required a co-signer to close the deal. Specifically, they needed a co-signer with a flawless credit history and over $1 million in newly acquired liquid assets. Jacob slid a thick stack of loan documents across the coffee table. He placed a heavy silver pen on top of the signature line. He looked at me with that fake salesman smile and told me it was just a formality. He promised he would make all the monthly payments. He just needed my name and my financial backing on the paper to appease the bank. I looked down at the silver pen. It reflected the afternoon light streaming through the living room window. Then I looked up at my firstborn son. I looked at the man who had just stood in my kitchen and watched his sister demand death benefits while I was still breathing. I reached out, picked up the silver pen, and set it down firmly on the far side of the table, entirely out of his reach. "I will not sign those papers, Jacob," I said, my voice quiet, but laced with absolute finality. The fake smile vanished from his face instantly. The friendly salesman disappeared, and the panicked, cornered animal emerged. He blinked rapidly, his breathing suddenly shallow. "Dad, you do not understand," he stammered, his voice rising in pitch. "The deposit is non-refundable. Do you hear me? Non-refundable. If we do not close on this condo by Friday, I lose $75,000. I lose everything I have left in my accounts. You gambled with money." "You did not have," I replied, keeping my posture rigid in the armchair. "You made a profoundly foolish financial decision based on an arrogant assumption that my life savings belonged to you. That is your mistake to absorb, not mine." Jacob jumped up from the sofa. He began pacing the narrow space between the coffee table and the television, running his hands through his perfectly styled hair, ruining the expensive look. The panic in his eyes was turning into something much darker. It was turning into aggressive desperation. "You have to sign it," he shouted, pointing a trembling finger at the documents. "You just sold 200 acres for over $1 million. You are sitting on a mountain of cash doing absolutely nothing. Signing that paper costs you $0 today. It just proves to the bank that you have my back. Co-signing a luxury mortgage for a man drowning in hidden debt costs me everything when you inevitably default." I shot back, gripping the armrests of my chair. "I will not put a lien on my survival to fund your vanity. The answer is no. Pick up your brochures and leave my house." Jacob stopped pacing. He turned to face me, and the physical shift in his demeanor was terrifying. I was no longer trying to persuade me. He was trying to intimidate me. He stepped around the coffee table, closing the distance between us until he was looming directly over my armchair. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and suddenly furious. "You owe me this." He hissed, his face leaning down close to mine. "I have spent my entire adult life trying to look successful, trying to build a network, trying to be the man you expected me to be. I am drowning in debt, trying to keep up appearances. If I lose this condo, if I lose that deposit, I am ruined. My creditors will tear me apart. You are my father. You are supposed to protect me. You are a 42-year-old man." I said, refusing to shrink back into my chair despite his looming presence. "I am not your safety net anymore." His breathing was heavy, his fists clenched tightly at his sides. He was vibrating with a toxic cocktail of entitlement and sheer terror. He was staring at me not as a son looking at his father, but as a desperate man looking at the only obstacle standing between him and survival. He was trapped in a financial prison of his own making, and I held the only key. By refusing to hand it over, I was sealing his fate. He did not step back. He stayed hovering over me, his shadow casting a dark chill over my chair. The air in the room grew dangerously tight. The foundation for what was about to happen had been poured, dried, and set in stone. I was completely out of options, and a man with no options is a man capable of doing the unthinkable. The 3 weeks following my refusal to fund their arrogant lifestyles were a quiet and tense waiting game. The dust finally settled on the farm, but I knew a dark storm was gathering in the city. My children had gone completely silent. There were no phone calls and no text messages. I used that time to pack up my belongings and prepare for my move to a smaller place, but I never let my guard down. I knew their silence was not acceptance. It was calculation. It all came to a head on that Sunday afternoon, bringing us right back to the moment my rib cracked. The house was quiet. I was standing in the kitchen, wiping down the counters and savoring the peace of a life finally unburdened by farm labor. But that peace was violently shattered by the sound of tires roaring up the gravel driveway. It was not a casual weekend visit. It was an invasion. Jacob and Natalie burst through the front door without knocking. They moved with a synchronized and predatory energy. There were no pleasantries or fake hugs. Jacob was clutching a thick manila folder, and Natalie was gripping a silver pen. They marched straight into the kitchen, trapping me between the island counter and the heavy oak dining table. I could feel the hostility radiating off them. They had spent the last 21 days stewing in their financial ruin, and they had finally decided to stop asking and start taking. Jacob slammed the manila folder down on the kitchen counter. He did not pull out glossy real estate brochures this time. He pulled out a stack of dense, legally binding documents. The heading at the very top was printed in bold black ink. It read, "Durable Power of Attorney." My stomach tightened immediately. I knew exactly what that piece of paper meant. It was the legal equivalent of a hostile takeover. Natalie stepped forward first. Her voice dripped with a fake and sickeningly sweet concern that made my skin crawl. She looked at me with wide, pitiful eyes and began her performance. She told me they had been talking, and they were deeply worried about my cognitive health. She claimed my behavior over the past few weeks had been erratic and completely irrational. She lied right to my face, telling me I was forgetting things and making poor choices. She spun a narrative that I was overwhelmed by the grief of losing my wife and selling the farm. She stated that the stress of managing a massive fortune at my advanced age was clearly destroying my mind. Jacob leaned against the counter and crossed his arms, playing the role of the responsible patriarch. He told me that leaving over $1 million in a standard account was dangerous for a man getting up in years. He spoke to me as if I were a confused toddler holding a loaded weapon. He fabricated stories on the spot, claiming he had noticed me looking disoriented around the property. He said there were scammers everywhere looking to take advantage of vulnerable seniors, and that I was a prime target. He insisted that signing over legal control to them was the absolute only way to protect the family legacy. He promised they would handle all the stressful banking and investments, allowing me to simply relax and enjoy my retirement without lifting a finger. I looked down at the documents and then back up at my children. It was a perfectly choreographed psychological ambush. They were actively weaponizing my age against me. Because I had refused to bail out Natalie and fund Jacob with my hard-earned money, they had decided the only logical explanation was that I was losing my sanity. They were trying to gaslight me into doubting my own mind. They knew if they could convince me that I was too old and frail to handle my own money, they could legally strip me of my autonomy. With my signature on that line, Jacob would possess the absolute power to empty my accounts, buy his luxury condominium, and bail out Natalie without ever having to ask my permission again. I slowly picked up the document. The paper felt incredibly heavy in my hands. I read the specific clauses they thought I would simply gloss over in my old age. Full and unhindered access to all financial accounts. The ability to liquidate physical assets. The absolute power to alter estate planning and trusts. They were not asking to be my safety net. They were demanding the keys to the entire kingdom. They wanted to legally erase me while I was still standing right in front of them, breathing the same air. I looked at Natalie, whose eyes were darting nervously toward the pen in her hand. I looked at Jacob, whose jaw was clenched tight with greedy anticipation. They actually believed their theatrical performance was working. They thought their combined pressure would completely overwhelm an old and tired farmer. They assumed I would sign my life away just to buy some peace and quiet in my own home. I took a slow and deep breath, feeling the cool kitchen air fill my lungs. The profound sadness I had felt weeks ago was completely gone. It was replaced by a cold and hardened resolve. The two people standing in my kitchen were no longer my children asking for a favor. They were desperate adversaries attempting a brazen daylight robbery. I did not yell or raise my voice. I did not try to argue with their fabricated concerns about my mental health, because arguing would only give them the validation they were desperately seeking. I knew any display of emotion would be logged in their minds as further proof of my supposed instability. Instead, I held the document up in the quiet kitchen, ensuring they both had a clear view of the pages. The silence stretched thick and incredibly dangerous as I prepared to show them exactly how competent I truly was. I held the thick stack of papers in my weathered hands. The stark black letters of the document stared back at me. This was not a request for a loan. This was a legal execution. They wanted to strip away my autonomy and reduce me to a ward of the state in my own home. I looked at the pages detailing how Jacob would have absolute authority over my bank accounts, my property, and my medical decisions. If I signed my name on that dotted line, I would become a ghost. I would be entirely at their mercy. And based on the greedy hunger burning in their eyes, I knew exactly how much mercy they had to offer. None. Natalie stepped closer to me. She extended her hand holding a heavy silver pen. Her hand was actually trembling. She was so close to getting her bailout that she could practically taste the money. "Just sign it, Dad," she urged. Her voice was a sickening imitation of a caring daughter. "We will take care of everything. You will never have to worry about a single bill or bank transfer ever again. You can just rest. I looked from the silver pen to my daughter's face. I saw the desperation masking itself as concern. I turned my gaze to Jacob. He was standing near the refrigerator with his arms crossed, trying to look like an authoritative patriarch. He gave me a slow nod, trying to encourage my compliance. He needed my signature to save his luxury condominium and prevent his financial ruin. They were hunting me. They had cornered their prey, and they were waiting for me to surrender my life to them. My hands closed tightly around the thick stack of legal documents. I did not reach for the pen Natalie was holding out to me. Instead, I gripped the top of the pages with my left hand and the bottom with my right. The kitchen was so quiet that the sound of my breathing felt loud. I looked Jacob directly in the eye, making sure he saw the absolute clarity and strength in my gaze. Then I pulled my hands apart. The sound of thick legal paper tearing echoed sharply in the silent kitchen. It was a crisp and violent rip. Natalie gasped and dropped her hand. The silver pen clattered onto the linoleum floor and rolled away. I did not stop. I placed the torn halves together and ripped them again. It took a significant amount of effort from my old hands, but the adrenaline pumping through my veins gave me all the strength I needed. I tore their desperate, hostile takeover into useless pieces of scrap paper. I opened my hands and let the torn shreds flutter to the kitchen floor. They scattered like dead leaves across the linoleum landing at Natalie's expensive designer shoes. "No," I said. My voice was calm, but it carried the weight of absolute finality. "I am not your ward. I am not losing my mind. And I will never hand over the keys to my life so you can fund your pathetic delusions of grandeur. Get out of my house." The reaction was instantaneous. The fake concern vanished completely. Natalie let out a shriek of pure frustration, grabbing the sides of her head as if her world had just ended. But it was Jacob who truly snapped. His entire financial house of cards relied on those papers. He had promised his creditors money that he did not have. He had gambled his entire reputation on my compliance. Watching those papers fall to the floor meant watching his own destruction. "You stubborn old fool!" Jacob roared. His face contorted into a mask of pure rage. He lost all sense of control. He lost his restraint. He lunged forward, closing the distance between the refrigerator and my chair in a fraction of a second. I had no time to react. I had no time to put up my hands or brace myself. He slammed his open palms directly into my chest with a terrifying amount of force. It was not a simple push. It was a violent, explosive strike fueled by pure panic and deep-seated entitlement. My boots lost their grip on the smooth kitchen floor. I was thrown backward violently. My right side collided with the thick, unforgiving edge of the heavy oak dining table. A sickening crack snapped through the room. The sound was distinct and horrifying. A massive wave of white-hot pain exploded in my chest, stealing all the air from my lungs in an instant. It felt like a hot iron spike had been driven through my ribs. I collapsed onto the floor, gasping desperately for air that simply would not come. My vision blurred around the edges. I curled onto my side, clutching my ribs as the agony radiated through my entire torso. Jacob stumbled backward. He looked down at his trembling hands as if they did not belong to him. The sheer violence of his own actions seemed to shock him out of his blind rage. His face drained of all color, turning a sickly pale gray. Natalie stood frozen near the counter, her hands covering her mouth, her eyes wide with absolute horror. They were staring down at me, expecting the frail old man to cry out for mercy. They expected me to scream in pain or beg them to call an ambulance, but I refused to give them that satisfaction. I fought through the blinding pain. Every breath was a grueling battle, but my mind had never been sharper. The physical assault was the final absolute confirmation I needed. My children were gone. The people standing in my kitchen were dangerous strangers who would physically harm an old man to get to his bank accounts. I forced myself to breathe through my nose. I pushed my left hand against the cold linoleum and slowly, painfully pushed myself up. My right arm stayed clamped tightly against my broken rib. I did not groan. I did not yell. I leaned my weight against the lower kitchen cabinets and managed to get to my feet. The pain was excruciating, but my resolve was made of iron. I looked at Jacob. He was breathing heavily, shaking his head slowly, as if trying to deny what he had just done. I reached into my pocket. My fingers found my phone. I pulled it out, ignoring their terrified stares. I opened the message I had prepared earlier for my lawyer, Neil. I hit send. I looked at the two of them. They were completely paralyzed by fear. I whispered the words that would seal their fate. You just lost everything. Then I turned away. I did not wait for their apologies. I did not wait for them to invent excuses or beg for forgiveness. Every step I took sent a fresh wave of agony through my broken rib, but I did not stumble. I walked out of the kitchen, down the short hallway, and straight to the front door. Behind me, the house was completely silent. They did not try to stop me. They were trapped in the gravity of their own catastrophic mistake. I opened the heavy front door and stepped out onto the porch. The cool afternoon breeze hit my face. I walked painfully down the wooden steps and toward my truck. I did not look back at the farmhouse. I did not look back at the cars parked in my driveway. I climbed into the driver's seat, wincing as I pulled the seatbelt across my chest. I started the engine and drove down the gravel path. I left them standing in the silent kitchen, surrounded by the torn shreds of their failed conspiracy. I was bleeding and broken, but as I drove toward the hospital, I knew one thing for certain. I was finally free. The drive to the county hospital was a blur of white-hot agony and deafening silence. Every groove in the asphalt and every turn of the steering wheel sent a brutal shockwave through my right side. I kept my left hand firmly gripped on the steering wheel while my right arm stayed tightly pinned against my ribs. The old truck cab felt impossibly small. I did not turn on the radio. I just listened to the steady hum of the engine and the harsh, shallow rhythm of my own breathing. I looked at the rearview mirror once. The dust from the gravel driveway was settling behind me. I was leaving the farm behind, and I was leaving my children behind with it. The hospital emergency room was a jarring transition from the quiet country roads. The fluorescent lights buzzed with a sterile, relentless glare. The smell of antiseptic and bleach stung my nose. I walked through the sliding glass doors with slow, calculated steps, refusing to hunch over. I approached the triage desk and handed over my identification. When the triage nurse asked me what happened, I did not hesitate. I looked her right in the eye and told her I lost my footing and fell hard against a solid oak table. I lied. I did not lie to protect Jacob. I lied because my lawyer Neil needed total control over the narrative. A police report filed by a frantic emergency room doctor would create chaos. I needed surgical precision. I needed an airtight legal strategy. They put me in a small examination room at the end of a long hallway. The walls were painted a pale, lifeless blue. The air conditioning blew cold air directly onto the thin paper gown they made me wear. I sat on the edge of the examination bed, listening to the crinkle of the paper beneath me. The doctor came in, pressed gently on my ribs, took some imaging, and confirmed what I already knew. A clean fracture of the 7th rib. He wrapped my torso tightly with medical tape and handed me a prescription for heavy pain medication. He told me to rest and avoid lifting anything heavy. He spoke in a soft, sympathetic tone, assuming I was just a clumsy old man who had an unfortunate accident in his kitchen. When the doctor finally left me alone in that freezing room, I stared at the blank wall opposite the bed. The physical pain was a constant, sharp presence, but it paled in comparison to the crushing emotional weight bearing down on my chest. I sat there in the quiet isolation and confronted the absolute failure of my life as a father. I had spent 40 years believing that providing for my family was the ultimate expression of love. I woke up before the sun. I broke my back in the dirt, and I weathered terrible storms so my children would never know the sting of poverty. I thought I was building a fortress of security for them. I thought every dollar I put into their college funds, every car loan I co-signed, and every down payment I assisted with was a brick in the foundation of their happiness. But sitting in that cold hospital room, I realized I had not built a foundation. I had built a transaction. I thought about Jacob. I thought about the sheer panic in his eyes right before he shoved me. It was not the panic of a son losing his father. It was the panic of a businessman losing his primary investor. I thought about Natalie. I remembered her screeching demands for $100,000, as if she were ordering a meal off a menu. I remembered the absolute absence of empathy in her voice. For my children, love and money had become completely and toxically intertwined. They could not separate the two concepts. To them, my love was measured exclusively by my willingness to fund their lifestyles. When I was paying their debts, I was a good father. The very second I closed the vault, I became an enemy. I became an obstacle that needed to be legally erased or physically removed. I closed my eyes and let the harsh reality wash over me. I had taught them how to spend, but I had never taught them how to earn. I had provided them with endless resources, but I had failed to provide them with character. My late wife had shielded them from consequence, and I had funded the shield. We had created two adults who believed the world owed them comfort, and that my sole purpose on earth was to deliver it to them. A profound melancholy settled deep in my bones. It was a grief heavier than mourning the loss of a loved one because my children were still alive. They were out there breathing and walking the earth, but the souls I thought they possessed simply did not exist. I was grieving the illusion of my family. I had to accept that the boy who used to ride on my shoulders and the girl who used to hold my hand had grown into ruthless predators. I looked down at my weathered hands resting on my knees. They were scarred and calloused from decades of honest work. Those hands had built a fortune, and those hands were now going to dismantle the monster that fortune had created. I was not going to cry for them anymore. The time for parental forgiveness had passed the exact moment my ribs snapped. Jacob and Natalie had made their choice. They had chosen greed over family. They had chosen violence over respect. They wanted to play a high-stakes game of wealth and power. I took a slow, shallow breath, feeling the tight pull of the medical wrap around my chest. I slowly buttoned up my flannel shirt, hiding the bandages. I stood up from the examination bed, placing my feet firmly on the cold tile floor. The pain was still there, sharp and unforgiving, but I welcomed it. The pain was a perfect reminder. It was a physical anchor keeping me focused on the task ahead. I was leaving the hospital, and I was going to teach my children the one lesson they had managed to avoid their entire lives, the lesson of absolute total consequence. I shifted my weight on the crinkling paper of the hospital bed. The doctor had just stepped out, leaving me alone with my thoughts and the dull, throbbing ache in my right side. I stared at the pale ceiling tiles, trying to process the magnitude of what had just happened in my kitchen. The betrayal was a heavy blanket pressing down on me. I was mourning the illusion of my family when a sharp buzz vibrated against my thigh. It was my phone. I reached into my pocket, wincing as the movement pulled tightly at my newly wrapped ribs. I fully expected to see a barrage of desperate text messages from Natalie. I expected a fabricated, trembling apology from Jacob. I assumed they were sitting in my silent farmhouse, terrified of the police showing up at their door. I assumed they were crippled by guilt over the physical violence. I was completely wrong. The screen lit up with a bright red notification from my primary financial institution. Fraud alert. Unauthorized access attempt on the main holding account. I unlocked the screen, my heart beating a slow and heavy rhythm. I opened my secure email application. There was an urgent message from my personal wealth manager. The email stated that an individual identifying himself as my son had just tried to initiate a total freeze on all my liquid assets. The individual had submitted a digital scan of a durable power of attorney. He had explicitly informed the bank that I was currently hospitalized, medically incapacitated, and unable to manage my own affairs. The pieces of the puzzle slammed together in my mind with a sickening, absolute clarity. Jacob did not just lose his temper in my kitchen. The physical confrontation, the screaming match, even the presentation of the physical documents. It was all a meticulously planned distraction. He had already scanned the power of attorney before he even drove his expensive sports car up my gravel driveway. He knew I might refuse to sign it. He had a contingency plan ready to execute. He needed me out of the house. He needed me in a hospital bed to make his fabricated story credible to the bank managers. When he shoved me against that heavy oak table, he was not just a panicked man acting out of blind rage. I was neutralizing an obstacle. He pushed me knowing I would have to seek immediate medical attention. He intentionally created the exact paper trail he needed to prove to a judge or a bank teller that I was frail, failing, and hospitalized. While I was sitting in this freezing examination room, bleeding and mourning the loss of my children, my firstborn son was sitting in his luxury car, actively uploading a digital scan of a fraudulent document to steal my entire life savings. Any lingering trace of paternal sadness evaporated instantly. The profound melancholy that had weighed me down just 5 minutes ago was completely burned away. In its place, a freezing, absolute focus took hold of my mind. My son had not just assaulted me in a fit of panic. He had executed a premeditated, hostile takeover of my entire existence. He was trying to bury me alive financially, while the breath was still in my lungs. I sat up straight, completely ignoring the fiery pain radiating through my ribs. The physical agony was nothing compared to the cold fury pumping through my veins. The tears I thought I might shed for my ruined family dried up before they could even form. There would be no more mourning. There would be no more hoping for reconciliation. My children had declared war, and they had drawn first blood. I opened my contacts list and scrolled down until I found the name I was looking for. Neil Carter. Neil was not a soft-spoken family lawyer who mediated mild inheritance disputes. He was a corporate bulldog. He was a ruthless legal strategist who dismantled hostile takeovers and protected massive estates for breakfast. I had kept him on retainer for years, primarily to handle the complex agricultural contracts for the farm. I never imagined I would need his particular set of skills to protect me from my own flesh and blood. I tapped his name and raised the phone to my ear. It rang twice before he answered. I did not waste time with pleasantries or small talk. My voice was steady and completely devoid of emotion. I told Neil that my son had just attempted to seize my accounts using fraudulent documents. I told him that I was currently sitting in the emergency room with a broken rib, courtesy of that same son. Neil did not gasp or offer useless sympathy. He operated strictly on logic and aggressive action. He asked me exactly what I wanted to do. I told him I wanted to execute the nuclear option. I told him I wanted every single cent from the farm sale locked away behind an impenetrable legal wall by sunrise. I told him to prepare the blind trust we had casually discussed years ago. I wanted my money completely untouchable, entirely invisible to Jacob and Natalie. I also instructed him to immediately notify the bank fraud department that the power of attorney was invalid, and that any further contact from my children should be treated as a criminal attempt at elder financial abuse. Neil confirmed the instructions. He promised the paperwork would be in motion before I even left the hospital parking lot. We ended the call. I stood up from the examination bed, placing my boots firmly on the cold tile floor. I grabbed my jacket and carefully slid my arms into the sleeves. I walked out of the small room, down the brightly lit hallway, and through the automatic sliding glass doors of the emergency room. The cool evening air hit my face, feeling crisp and clean. I walked slowly toward my truck, parked under the harsh yellow glow of a street lamp. I did not feel like a broken old man anymore. The vulnerable father who had hoped his children would eventually learn the value of hard work was dead. In his place was a man who knew exactly how to protect his legacy. I climbed into the driver's seat, started the engine, and drove out of the hospital lot. I was going to let Jacob and Natalie believe their clever little scheme was working just a little bit longer. But tomorrow, they would wake up to a reality more devastating than they could possibly imagine. The drive back to the farmhouse was darker than usual. The headlights of my old truck cut through the heavy country night. My right side throbbed with a dull and persistent ache. The medical tape binding my ribs felt like an iron cage every time I took a breath. I parked the truck in the gravel driveway and turned off the engine. I sat in the cab for a long moment. I looked at the dark silhouette of the house I had built with my own hands. It was the same house I had left just a few hours ago, but it felt entirely different now. It was no longer a family home. It was a crime scene. I climbed out of the truck and walked up the wooden porch steps. I unlocked the heavy front door and stepped into the entryway. The silence of the farmhouse was absolute. The torn pieces of the fraudulent legal documents were still scattered across the kitchen linoleum. They lay exactly where they had fallen. I did not bend down to pick them up. My children decided I was worth more to them incapacitated than alive. I walked slowly to the kitchen counter and placed my keys in the ceramic bowl. My smartphone began to vibrate in my jacket pocket. It had been vibrating incessantly for the past 2 hours. I pulled it out and looked at the glowing screen. There were 14 missed calls from Jacob and 9 from Natalie. My voicemail inbox was completely full. I placed the phone on the counter and tapped the screen to play the messages on the speaker. I wanted to hear exactly how they were trying to spin their catastrophic mistake. Jacob was the first voice to fill the quiet kitchen. He did not sound like the arrogant corporate executive who had demanded my signature just a few hours prior. He sounded breathless and terrified. "Dad, please pick up the phone," he pleaded. His voice was trembling with barely suppressed panic. "It was an accident. I swear to you, it was just an accident. I tripped and bumped into you. Please do not call the police. A police report will ruin my career. I will lose my job. Just call me back so we can fix this." I listened to his frantic lies without a single ounce of pity. He did not trip. He lunged at me with the full force of his desperate rage. He was not apologizing because he felt remorse for hurting his elderly father. He was apologizing because he realized a felony assault charge would destroy his precious credit rating and his corporate reputation. The next message was from Natalie. She was sobbing loudly into the receiver. "Dad, please answer me," she cried. "You know Jacob has a temper, but he did not mean to hurt you. You cannot ruin our lives over a misunderstanding. If the police show up at my boutique, the investors will pull out entirely. You have to think about the family. Please just come home and we can pretend this never happened." I stared at the phone as her tearful voice echoed off the kitchen walls. She was actually asking me to pretend my broken rib was a figment of my imagination. She was prioritizing the public image of her failing clothing store over the physical safety of her own father. They were not worried about my health. They were terrified of the legal consequences of their own actions. They thought they could sweep an assault under the rug with a few fake tears and a hollow apology. I did not call them back. I did not send a text message to reassure them. I let the heavy and terrifying sound of my absolute silence answer for me. I wanted them to sit in their expensive city apartments and sweat. I wanted them to stare at their phones and wonder if the next knock on their door would be the police arriving to arrest them. I reached for a notepad and a pen from the drawer next to the refrigerator. I needed to focus on the next step of the strategy. I had already spoken to Neil Carter from the hospital parking lot, but we needed to prepare for the immediate execution of the blind trust. Neil was not a man who wasted time. He was a legal predator who thrived on dismantling arrogant opponents. He had instructed me to return home and gather all my original financial ledgers, the corporate tax returns for the farm, and the original deed to the land. I poured myself a glass of cold water and swallowed the pain medication the emergency room doctor had prescribed. The sharp pain in my chest dulled to a heavy ache. I walked into my home office and turned on the small desk lamp. The room smelled of old paper and wood polish. I opened the heavy metal filing cabinet in the corner. I pulled out the thick leather binders containing 4 decades of meticulous financial records. Jacob and Natalie assumed I was just a simple farmer who did not understand complex wealth management. They assumed I kept my money in a standard checking account that they could easily freeze with a forged document. They were about to learn that the farm was a highly structured corporate entity. I placed the heavy binders on the desk. I looked at the clock on the wall. It was getting late, but I knew Neil was already working on the paperwork in his city office. He had promised to drive out to the farmhouse personally first thing in the morning to collect my physical signatures and finalize the financial lockdown. I sat down in my leather office chair and looked out the window into the dark country night. The frantic voicemails from my children were still fresh in my mind. They thought they could manipulate me with panic and guilt. But the man they thought they knew was gone. I was ready to protect my legacy with every legal weapon available to me. I closed my eyes and waited for the morning to arrive. The sun had barely broken over the horizon when the gravel in my driveway crunched under the tires of a sleek black town car. Neil Carter stepped out into the cool morning air. He wore an immaculate dark suit that looked completely out of place against the backdrop of my weathered barn. He carried a heavy leather briefcase and walked with the focused energy of a predator scenting blood. I opened the front door before he could even knock. Neil did not offer any useless sympathy about my heavily bandaged ribs. He simply gave me a curt nod and walked straight into my kitchen. He stopped for a brief moment to look at the torn pieces of the fraudulent power of attorney still scattered across the linoleum floor. He did not say a word about the mess. He stepped right over the shredded paper and sat down at the heavy oak dining table. I took the seat across from him, placing my thick leather binders carefully on the wood. We got straight to work. Neil opened his briefcase and pulled out a stack of fresh legal documents. He looked at me with cold, calculating eyes and told me that Jacob had made a monumental and foolish error. Jacob had taken his digital scan of that forged document and submitted it to the retail banking division. I was frantically trying to freeze a standard personal checking account. He truly believed the money from the farm sale was just sitting in a basic savings account, waiting to be withdrawn by anyone with a signature. This is where my children demonstrated their absolute ignorance. For my entire life, they looked at me and saw nothing but a simple dirt farmer in faded denim and muddy work boots. They thought my entire existence consisted of waking up early, planting seeds, and praying for rain. They never bothered to look past the dirt under my fingernails. They never knew what I was doing on the days I drove into the city wearing a suit. They never knew about the endless closed-door meetings with tax attorneys and wealth managers. Decades ago, I realized that working the land was only half the battle. Protecting the land and the wealth it generated was the real war. I did not just own a farm. I owned a highly structured corporate entity. I had meticulously built a limited liability company to shield our assets from liability and crushing tax burdens. Every acre of land, every piece of heavy machinery, and every crop yield was held within a complex corporate architecture. I had an operating company that handled the daily farming logistics and a holding company that protected the real estate assets. I understood capital gains depreciation and asset protection better than my son and his fake corporate persona ever could. Jacob walked around the city in expensive clothes, pretending to be a titan of industry, while he was actually drowning in massive debt. He thought I was just an uneducated old man he could easily swindle. Neil opened the first leather binder. He pointed to the official wire transfer confirmation from the buyers of the farm. The $1.2 million did not go into a personal bank account. It was wired directly into the corporate holding account in escrow. That specific account required dual signature, corporate authorization, and strict identity verification to move a single penny. The cheap generic power of attorney Jacob had printed off the internet was completely useless against a corporate wall of that magnitude. Jacob had essentially tried to rob an empty vault and managed to trip a federal banking alarm in the very same breath. A quiet and profound satisfaction settled over me. My children had vastly underestimated my financial literacy. They assumed that because I did not flaunt my wealth with leased sports cars and luxury condominiums, I must be financially clueless. They mistook my quiet humility for absolute stupidity. Now that arrogant assumption was going to be their ultimate downfall. Neil steepled his fingers and leaned across the oak table. He told me the fraud alert had already flagged Jacob in the internal banking security system. Any future attempts he made to access my personal funds would automatically trigger an immediate review by the fraud department. But Neil wanted to go much further. He did not just want to block them temporarily. He wanted to build an impenetrable legal fortress around my entire legacy. He looked at me and asked if I was ready to permanently cut the financial cord. He wanted to know if I had any lingering hesitation about leaving my children to face the harsh realities of their own actions. I thought about the blinding pain in my ribs every time I took a deep breath. I thought about Natalie demanding an advance on her inheritance while I was bleeding on the floor. I thought about Jacob trying to steal my life savings while I was sitting alone in a freezing hospital room. I looked Neil right in the eye. I told him I had absolutely no hesitation left in my heart. I instructed him to proceed with the absolute maximum level of financial retaliation. I told him it was time to close the vault permanently and let my children face the real world without a safety net. Neil reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of pristine white paper. He placed it squarely on the heavy oak dining table right in front of me. He called it the kill switch. In legal terms, it was an irrevocable blind trust. Neil explained the mechanism with the cold precision of a military tactician. Once my signature was on the final page, the $1.2 million from the farm sale would be instantly transferred out of the corporate holding accounts. It would vanish into a legal fortress managed entirely by an independent third-party trustee. I listened to the steady rhythm of Neil speaking. He made it absolutely clear that the word irrevocable meant exactly what it sounded like. I could not change my mind next week. I could not reverse the transfer if I suddenly felt a pang of paternal guilt. Once the money moved, it was gone from my direct control forever. It was a terrifying concept for a man who had managed every single penny he earned for 40 years. But sitting in my kitchen with a fractured rib burning in my chest, the idea of losing direct control did not scare me at all. It liberated me. Neil pushed the document closer to me. He pointed to the empty lines requiring my signature. He told me that Jacob was likely consulting with bottom-feeding lawyers at this very moment, trying to find a back door into my personal finances. Jacob would be searching for any loophole, any temporary injunction, or any emergency medical mandate to freeze my assets. But a blind trust would completely neutralize him. The money would simply cease to exist in any capacity that Jacob could legally target. He could forge 100 different power of attorney documents and wave them in front of a dozen different judges, but it would be completely useless. You cannot steal what is no longer there. I looked down at the paper. My right arm ached terribly as I reached across the table and picked up the heavy black pen Neil had provided. I thought about the sweat that had dripped from my brow during the summer harvests. I thought about the freezing winter mornings when I could not feel my fingers, but kept working anyway to make sure my children had a warm house to sleep in. All of that labor, all of that sacrifice was distilled into the ink flowing from this pen. I pressed the pen to the paper. I signed my name on the first line. My signature was firm and clear. I turned the page and signed again. I moved through the stack of documents with a steady and rhythmic motion. With every stroke of the pen, I was building a massive, unscalable wall between my life savings and the two people who wanted to loot it. I was permanently cutting the financial cord. Neil watched me in complete silence. He gathered the signed pages one by one, checking to ensure every initial was perfectly placed. He took out his official notary stamp and pressed it hard against the final page. The loud thump of the hitting the table sounded like a heavy vault door slamming shut and locking forever. He looked at me and stated that it was done. The transfer was initiated. Within the hour, the entire balance of the farm sale would be securely housed inside the trust. I leaned back in my chair, taking a slow, carefully measured breath to protect my broken rib. A wave of profound and absolute relief washed over my entire body. The anxiety that had been gnawing at the back of my mind since the hospital evaporated. Jacob could rage all he wanted. Natalie could scream and cry until she lost her voice. It simply did not matter anymore. The kill switch had been successfully flipped. The vault was empty. I looked out the kitchen window toward the empty fields. The land belonged to someone else now, but the legacy of my hard work was finally safe. I had spent decades trying to provide for my children, hoping they would understand the value of honest labor. I had failed to teach them that lesson while my wife was alive, but I was finally teaching them today. The money was completely untouchable. They were going to have to face the world with nothing but their own two hands, just like I did when I was their age. Every dollar I earned had been weaponized against me by my own flesh and blood. They believed my wealth was a birthright they could claim through intimidation and physical violence. But as Neil packed the executed trust documents back into his leather briefcase, that birthright was legally incinerated. Jacob and Natalie were completely severed from the fortune they thought they already owned. The financial lockdown was complete. Protecting the money was the shield. Now it was time to pick up the sword. I turned my attention back to Neil, ready to execute the next phase of the operation. Neil closed his leather briefcase with a solid click. The defensive wall was completely built and the money was gone. I looked at the lawyer sitting across my kitchen table and nodded slowly. Shielding my assets from my children was only the first half of the operation. They had assaulted me in my own home and tried to legally erase my existence. Simply hiding my money felt insufficient. It was time to take the offensive and systematically dismantle the fake lives I had been funding for them. I opened the second leather binder on my table. This binder did not hold the farm closing documents. It held the meticulous ledgers of every single financial bailout I had provided to Jacob and Natalie over the past decade. For years, I had quietly absorbed their financial failures. I called them soft loans to spare their pride, but we all knew they were handouts. They had used my generosity to build a facade of wealth and success. I decided it was time to tear down that facade brick by brick. I slid a file across the table to Neil. It contained the commercial lease agreement for Natalie and her high-end boutique. Natalie liked to pretend she was a self-made fashion entrepreneur. She bragged to her friends about her business acumen. She conveniently left out the fact that my corporate entity actually purchased the building housing her store. I had given her a dramatically reduced rent to help her get started. But Natalie had not paid a single dime of rent in over 2 years. I had simply let the arrears accumulate on the books because she was my daughter. I instructed Neil to draft an immediate notice of default and termination of the lease. She was legally operating in my building while aggressively trying to steal my life savings. Neil took notes with a grim expression. He explained that he would issue a formal demand for the 2 years of unpaid back rent. When she inevitably failed to produce the funds, he would initiate a commercial eviction. Her entire fashion empire was built on my real estate. She was about to lose her storefront, her inventory, and her fake entrepreneurial identity in one swift legal motion. I turned the page in my binder and focused my attention on Jacob. My firstborn son had shoved me against a table because he was desperate to maintain his wealthy corporate image. That image was completely fabricated. The sleek luxury sports car he drove to my farm was a perfect example of his financial smoke and mirrors. Jacob could not secure the financing for that car on his own merit because his credit was a disaster. I had co-signed the loan document 3 years ago. Furthermore, I had been quietly making the monthly payments every time his account came up short, to prevent the bank from penalizing my own credit score. I told Neil to contact the automotive lender immediately. I instructed him to formally withdraw my financial backing as the co-signer. I provided Neil with the documentation showing Jacob had defaulted on his portion of the agreement months ago. Neil stated that notifying the lender of Jacob and his fraudulent behavior regarding the power of attorney would trigger an immediate default clause in the automotive contract. The bank would demand the entire remaining balance of the loan paid in full by the end of the week. Jacob did not have that kind of cash. The bank would issue a repossession order. The tow trucks would be looking for his luxury car before the weekend. We did not stop there. We went through the ledgers line by line. There was the $50,000 loan I gave Jacob to cover a bad investment. There were the thousands of dollars I fronted Natalie for her lavish vacations when she claimed she was going on business trips. I had kept the receipts, the bank transfer records, and the text messages acknowledging the funds. Neil organized them into a massive stack of formal demand letters. I was calling in every single debt. I sat back in my chair, feeling the ache in my broken rib. I was systematically stripping away the armor of privilege I had provided for my children. They had grown arrogant because they never had to face the consequences of a bounced check or a final notice. They believed they were superior to the dirt farmer who raised them because they wore expensive clothes and drove fast cars. They completely forgot that the dirt farmer owned the clothes on their backs and the tires on their cars. Neil gathered the new stack of offensive paperwork. He assured me that the demand letters and eviction notices would be dispatched by certified courier directly to their city apartments. They had expected me to cower in fear after the physical altercation. They had expected me to quietly surrender my fortune to avoid a messy public dispute. They were about to receive a tidal wave of legal consequences delivered right to their front doors. I walked Neil to the front porch and watched his black car drive away down the gravel path. The morning sun was fully up now, bathing the empty farm fields in a warm golden light. The quiet peace of the country morning settled over me. I was wounded, and I was alone, but I was no longer a victim. I had drawn a hard line in the sand. My children wanted to play a ruthless game of corporate theft and financial ruin. I was simply showing them that I owned the board and I made the rules. I went back inside the house to wait for the storm to hit the city. 4 days had passed since I left the farmhouse and relocated to a temporary short-term rental in the city. The apartment was completely sterile. The walls were painted a bright clinical white, and the furniture was stiff and unwelcoming. It was a jarring change from the warm wooden walls and deep armchairs of my home, but it served its purpose perfectly. It was neutral ground. It was the exact type of impersonal corporate space my children respected. I sat in a rigid leather chair near the window, watching the busy city street below. My ribs still ached with a dull, heavy rhythm, but the sharpest pain had subsided into a manageable throb. I had spent the last 96 hours in absolute silence. I ignored every single call, every text message, and every frantic voicemail. Jacob and Natalie had left me. I let them stew in the quiet void of my absence. Then this morning I sent them both a simple single text message. I told them to meet me at this address at 2 in the afternoon to finalize the financial transfers. I knew exactly how they would interpret that message. In their minds, my silence was not a strategic maneuver. It was a sign of weakness. They believed the old farmer had finally broken under the pressure. They thought I had retreated to the city to lick my wounds and accept my defeat. They assumed I had summoned them to hand over the checks to avoid any further conflict or legal embarrassment. Exactly at 2 o'clock, the heavy buzzer of the apartment echoed in the quiet room. I pressed the button on the wall intercom to unlock the lobby doors. A few minutes later, a sharp, confident knock hit my front door. I stood up slowly, making sure to keep my posture slightly hunched. I wanted to give them exactly the version of me they expected to see. I opened the door and found my 2 children standing in the hallway. The sheer arrogance radiating from them was almost suffocating. Jacob was wearing a brand new tailored navy suit. His hair was perfectly styled, and he held a sleek leather portfolio tucked confidently under his arm. The panicked, desperate man who had shoved me against a kitchen table was completely gone. He had replaced that vulnerability with a smug, victorious posture. He looked at me with a faint, patronizing smile, as if he were a forgiving king visiting a defeated peasant. Natalie stood right beside him, exuding the same toxic confidence. She wore a bright red designer dress and held an oversized luxury handbag. Her posture was relaxed, and her expression was incredibly bored. She was tapping her manicured nails against the screen of her phone, checking her notifications, while completely ignoring the fact that she was standing in front of the father her brother had recently assaulted. They did not ask how I was feeling. They did not apologize for the violence in the kitchen. They walked right past me, stepping into the apartment, as if they owned the building. Jacob looked around the sterile living room and let out a soft, condescending chuckle. "Well, Dad," he said, his voice dripping with false sympathy. "I am glad you decided to be reasonable. We were getting worried about you staying out in the country all by yourself. This city place is a bit small, but it is much safer for someone your age." Natalie dropped her heavy handbag onto the glass coffee table with a loud thud. She crossed her arms and looked at me with an impatient sigh. "Let us just get this over with," she demanded. "I have a massive inventory shipment being held at the warehouse right now. The vendors are demanding payment by 5 today. I really need to get the wire transfer initiated immediately, or my entire seasonal launch is going to be ruined." I closed the front door and locked it, hearing the heavy deadbolt click into place. I turned around and looked at them. They had walked into the room expecting a complete surrender. They believed the hard part was over. Jacob took a seat on the leather sofa, opening his portfolio. He pulled out a fresh copy of the same fraudulent power of attorney document he had brought to the farm, along with several blank bank transfer forms. He laid them out on the glass table, smoothing the edges with his hands. "Look, Dad," Jacob said, using a tone one might use to soothe a frightened dog. "I know things got a little heated the other day. I apologize if I came on too strong. But you have to understand the immense pressure I am under. This condo deal is the biggest investment of my life. I just need you to sign these release forms so the bank can process the down payment. Once the money is moved, we can put all this ugly family drama behind us. You can relax, and Natalie and I can finally secure our futures." I walked slowly toward the center of the room. I did not sit down. I stood tall, feeling the familiar, sharp pain in my ribs, and I embraced it. I looked at the legal documents resting on the glass table. Then I looked at the two arrogant adults sitting on my sofa. They were so blinded by their own greed that they could not see the trap closing around them. They had no idea that the money they were eagerly waiting to collect had completely ceased to exist in any account bearing my name. I kept my expression entirely neutral. I did not raise my voice or show any trace of anger. I simply told them that the financial arrangements had already been completed. I told them that the money from the farm sale was fully secured and that the necessary legal documents were ready for their review. Natalie let out a relieved laugh and leaned back against the cushions. Finally, she said, rolling her eyes toward the ceiling, "I seriously thought you were going to drag this out in court and make us all miserable. I am glad you finally woke up and realized this money belongs to the family." Jacob smiled broadly and picked up his expensive pen. He held it out toward me, waiting for me to take it and sign my life away. He was completely relaxed, completely arrogant, and completely unaware that his financial execution was only seconds away. I did not take the pen. I simply reached into the inner pocket of my jacket and pulled out the 2 thick manila envelopes Neil had prepared for me. I held them in my hands, feeling the heavy weight of absolute justice. I looked at my children and prepared to show them exactly what my silence over the past few days had truly meant. I stood in the center of the pristine white living room, holding the 2 thick manila envelopes. They felt heavy in my hands. It was the weight of absolute consequence. I extended my arms and held the envelopes out toward my children. Jacob dropped his expensive silver pen onto the glass coffee table. He eagerly reached forward and snatched the envelope from my left hand. His face broke into a massive, greedy smile. He let out a loud breath of relief, completely convinced that the paperwork inside was the final authorization for his luxury condominium. Natalie did not even wait for me to hand hers over. She lunged forward and grabbed the second envelope from my right hand. Her eyes were wide with desperate anticipation. She practically tore the heavy paper flap open, her manicured fingernails ripping through the seal. She muttered about how she needed to get the routing numbers to her warehouse vendors immediately. I stepped back and crossed my arms over my chest, carefully protecting my injured rib. I watched them in absolute silence. Natalie pulled her documents out first. She did not find a crisp bank check. She did not find a wire transfer confirmation. She found a stack of stark, intimidating legal papers bearing the seal of Neil Carter and his corporate law firm. Her eyes darted across the bold black text at the top of the first page. I watched the arrogant impatience drain entirely from her face. It was replaced by a look of profound confusion that quickly morphed into sheer terror. "What is this?" she whispered. Her voice was shaking so badly she could barely form the words. This says notice of default. This says commercial eviction. Dad, what is this?" I kept my voice perfectly level. I told her it was exactly what it appeared to be. I reminded her that my corporate entity owned the building housing her boutique. I stated that she had not paid a single dime of rent in over 2 years. I explained that the grace period was officially over. The demand letter required immediate payment in full for 24 months of back rent. I told her that since she clearly did not have those funds, the eviction process was already in motion. Her doors would be padlocked by the end of the business day tomorrow. Natalie dropped the papers onto the glass table as if they had burned her fingers. She backed away, her hands covering her mouth, her breathing shallow and frantic. She realized in that exact moment that her fake fashion empire was completely annihilated. Jacob was not paying attention to his sister. He was frantically tearing into his own envelope. He pulled out his stack of legal documents, and his confident smile vanished the second his eyes hit the first paragraph. His face turned a sickly shade of pale gray. He started flipping rapidly through the pages, his hands trembling violently. "This is a withdrawal of financial backing," Jacob stammered. His eyes darted wildly around the room. "This is a default notification for my car loan. Dad, you cannot do this. You are my co-signer. If you withdraw your backing, the bank will demand the entire balance immediately. They will repossess my car." I nodded slowly, confirming his exact fear. I told him I had already submitted the paperwork to the automotive lender. I explained that after he physically assaulted me in my kitchen, I no longer felt comfortable carrying his financial liabilities. I informed him that the repossession order was already active. The tow trucks were likely searching for his luxury vehicle right now. Jacob looked like the floor had just dropped out from underneath him. He was losing his car, and without my signature on his new mortgage, he was losing his $75,000 non-refundable deposit on the penthouse. I was financially ruined in the span of 30 seconds. But the final blow had not yet landed. There was a third document tucked inside both of their envelopes. I watched as Jacob slowly pulled it out. Natalie saw her brother freeze and reached down to pull the matching document from her own pile. It was a formal legal notice of the creation of an irrevocable blind trust. Jacob read the words aloud, his voice cracking under the weight of his mounting panic. He read the clause detailing the transfer of $1.2 million. He read the section confirming that the funds had been permanently removed from all personal accounts. Then he reached the final paragraph. He read the beneficiary designation. He looked up at me, his eyes wide with absolute horror. "You left it all to a charity," he whispered. His voice sounded hollow and completely defeated. I looked right back at him. I told him that the local agricultural charity would put the farm money to excellent use. I explained that they provided resources and education for young farmers, who actually wanted to work the land with their own two hands. I stated that the trust was entirely irrevocable. The transfer was finalized hours ago. The money was completely gone. The silence that filled the apartment was deafening. The arrogant, victorious energy they had brought into the room just 10 minutes ago had been completely incinerated. They had walked in expecting a massive payday. They were now standing in the ashes of their financial lives. Natalie collapsed onto the leather sofa, burying her face in her hands. She began to sob uncontrollably. She cried about her ruined reputation, her lost boutique, and her empty bank accounts. She begged me to reverse the paperwork. She pleaded with me, claiming she was my little girl and that I was destroying her life. Jacob remained standing, but his entire posture had collapsed. The polished corporate executive was gone. I was just a terrified, desperate man drowning in debt. He dropped the legal documents onto the coffee table. He looked at me with a mixture of disbelief and pure desperation. "You cannot do this to us," Jacob yelled, his voice breaking into a high-pitched panic. "We are your children. You cannot just cut us off and leave us with nothing. We will lose everything." I stood my ground, looking at the two people who had plotted to declare me mentally incompetent just so they could steal my life savings. I told them they were finally experiencing the real world. I explained that actions have consequences, and that my money was no longer available to shield them from their own reckless choices. I told them the vault was permanently closed. Their arrogant arrival had turned into a total and devastating defeat. But Jacob was a cornered animal, and a cornered animal always fights back when it realizes it has nothing left to lose. He clenched his fists and took a step toward me, his desperation shifting back into aggression. I was about to try one last desperate maneuver to regain control. Jacob stood frozen for a fraction of a second before the sheer reality of his financial ruin snapped his mind in two. The terrified and desperate man was instantly replaced by a cornered and furious animal. He took a heavy step toward me, and his face flushed a dark, dangerous red. He pointed a shaking finger at my chest, and his voice vibrated with a toxic mix of panic and pure rage. He told me I was not going to get away with this. He screamed that I had no right to give away family money to strangers just to punish them. He leaned over the glass coffee table, and his knuckles turned white as he pressed his weight onto the delicate surface. He told me he was leaving this apartment and driving straight to a courthouse. He threatened to file an emergency injunction to freeze the blind trust immediately. He sneered, and his lips curled into a vicious, ugly smile. He said he was going to stand before a judge and swear under oath that I had lost my mind. He promised to bring in ruthless lawyers and fabricate witnesses to prove I was mentally incompetent. He told me he would have me locked away in a psychiatric facility and take back every single penny by force. Natalie stopped sobbing for just a moment and looked up at her brother with a sudden, desperate glimmer of hope. They really thought this empty legal threat was their ultimate trump card. They believed they could bully an old man into submission by weaponizing his age and his health. I did not flinch. I did not step back. I stood perfectly still and let his pathetic threats echo in the quiet, sterile room. I looked at the vein bulging in his neck. I looked at the sheer arrogance he still possessed even while standing in the ashes of his own life. I slowly reached into the breast pocket of my jacket. I did not pull out a checkbook. I did not pull out a legal reversal form. I pulled out a small silver USB drive. I held it between my thumb and index finger and let it catch the light from the large window. I stepped forward and placed it deliberately onto the glass table right next to his eviction notices and repossession orders. I pushed it with my index finger, sending it sliding smoothly across the glass until it stopped directly in front of his trembling hands. Jacob looked down at the small piece of metal, and his brow furrowed in deep confusion. I kept my voice incredibly low, forcing him to stop shouting and listen closely. I told him that he had vastly underestimated my preparation. I explained that living alone on a massive, isolated farm meant taking security very seriously. I revealed that I had installed high-definition motion-activated cameras inside the farmhouse kitchen years ago to monitor the property while I was working out in the fields. I watched the color completely drain from his face as the realization hit him like a physical blow. I told him that the silver drive contained crisp, clear, and undeniable video and audio footage of him violently shoving a 71-year-old man against a heavy oak table. I told him it captured the exact sickening sound of my rib snapping in two. I added that the drive also contained the official medical records from the emergency room, explicitly detailing the blunt force trauma and the fractured bone. I let that information sink into his mind, and I watched his arrogant posture crumble into absolute paralyzing fear. Before Jacob could even stammer out a defense, the heavy oak door of the adjoining bedroom clicked open. The sound was as sharp as a gunshot in the silent apartment. Neil Carter stepped out into the living room. He looked immaculate, wearing his tailored dark suit and carrying a single thick legal document in his hands. He walked with the terrifying predatory calmness of a man who held a literal death sentence in his grip. Natalie let out a choked gasp and shrank back into the sofa cushions. Jacob stumbled backward, and his knees hit the edge of the couch. Neil stopped right beside me. He did not introduce himself. He did not offer a polite greeting. He simply looked at Jacob with eyes as cold as ice and held up the document. He stated that it was a fully drafted, comprehensive police report, complete with the digital video evidence and official medical documentation. He explained that it outlined formal charges for felony elder abuse, aggravated assault, and attempted financial extortion. Neil tapped his expensive watch. He informed Jacob that the local police precinct had a dedicated task force for elder abuse, and that he had a personal contact waiting for his call right now. He stated that if he pressed a single button on his phone, squad cars would be dispatched to this apartment within 3 minutes. Jacob would be arrested, handcuffed, and dragged out of this building in front of everyone. His corporate career would be instantly annihilated by a violent felony conviction, and he would spend the next several years sleeping in a concrete cell. I stepped forward, closing the distance between us. I looked down at my son. He was shaking uncontrollably, and tears of pure, unadulterated terror were welling in his eyes. He was completely trapped, pinned between financial ruin and a literal prison sentence. I gave him my final ultimatum. I told him he had exactly 60 seconds to pick up his legal trash, walk out the front door, and never attempt to contact me again. If he did that, he would walk away with absolutely nothing, but he would walk away a free man. If he stayed, or if he ever tried to contest the trust in front of a judge, Neil would transmit the files and his life as he knew it would be completely over. Jacob looked at the silver drive resting on the glass table. He looked at Neil, who was holding his smartphone in his hand, with his thumb hovering ominously over the screen. Then Jacob looked at me. The realization finally broke him. The fight completely left his body, leaving nothing but a broken, terrified coward. He slowly reached down with his hands trembling violently and gathered his useless papers. He did not say a word. He did not look me in the eye. He grabbed Natalie by the arm and dragged her off the sofa. She was sobbing hysterically, clutching her designer bag to her chest like a shield. They walked toward the door, moving with the heavy, shuffling steps of entirely defeated people. Jacob reached out with a shaking hand and turned the deadbolt. He opened the door and stepped out into the hallway, pulling his sister behind him. They did not look back. The heavy door swung shut, and the latch clicked securely into place. The silence that followed was beautiful. The toxic, greedy infection had finally been surgically removed from my life. I looked at Neil, gave him a slow nod, and took a deep, painless breath. Checkmate. The heavy apartment door clicked shut, and the deadbolt slid firmly into place. I stood in the quiet hallway, listening to the faint sound of my children shuffling away toward the elevators. The suffocating tension that had filled the room completely dissipated. I was finally alone. I walked over to the window and looked down at the busy city street below. I knew the battle in this apartment was over, But I also knew my children. I knew they were incapable of accepting a defeat with any shred of dignity. They were going to try and spin a desperate narrative to save face. By early that evening, my phone began to buzz gently on the kitchen counter. I did not answer the calls immediately. I sat at the small dining table drinking a glass of cold water and letting the notifications accumulate. Natalie and Jacob were frantically working the phones. They were calling every aunt, uncle, and cousin in my contact list. They were weaving a pathetic and entirely fabricated tale about an old man who had completely lost his mind to grief. They claimed I was suffering from severe cognitive decline. They told our relatives that I was being manipulated by a predatory corporate lawyer who had maliciously brainwashed me into signing away the entire family legacy. Natalie sobbed hysterically into the receiver, telling my sister Diane that I was dangerously confused and needed a massive family intervention to save my own finances. Jacob called my nephews and cousins, playing the role of the deeply concerned patriarch who was simply trying to protect his sick father from making a catastrophic mistake. They fully expected an army of outraged relatives to descend upon my apartment. They anticipated that the extended family would immediately rally behind them and validate their manufactured victimhood. They thought they could weaponize the family against me and pressure me into reversing the irrevocable trust. But they fundamentally misunderstood how the rest of the world actually viewed them. My sister Diane called me the following morning. I answered the phone, expecting to have to defend my mental competency. Instead, my sister did not sound worried or panicked at all. She sounded incredibly amused. She told me that Natalie had called her the previous night, crying uncontrollably about being evicted from her boutique. Diane explained that she simply listened to Natalie complain for 20 minutes without offering a single word of sympathy. When Natalie finally paused to catch her breath, Diane calmly told her that it was time to get a real job and simply hung up the phone. My children had completely failed to realize that they had alienated the entire family long before they ever decided to assault me. For years, they had treated our extended relatives with the exact same suffocating arrogance they showed me. Jacob used to show up at our modest family barbecues and brag relentlessly about his corporate success while refusing to lift a single finger to help clean up the yard. Natalie would loudly complain about the cheap food served at holiday dinners and constantly flaunt her designer clothes to cousins who were working 2 jobs just to pay rent. My siblings and extended relatives had watched my late wife coddle them for decades. They all knew exactly how much money I had poured into funding their fake, extravagant lives. They saw the entitlement radiating from my children at every single family gathering. So when Jacob called my nephew Brian to beg for an emergency loan to save his luxury condominium down payment, Brian flatly refused. He calmly told Jacob that a highly successful corporate executive should really have a better emergency savings fund. The desperate smear campaign completely collapsed before it could even gain a single inch of traction. Not a single family member believed their ridiculous narrative of a confused elderly victim. My family knew the truth. They knew I had built a massive agricultural business from the dirt up through pure grit and intelligence. They knew my mind was as sharp as a steel trap and that I never made a financial decision without absolute certainty. My children suddenly found themselves entirely isolated in a cold and unforgiving world. They had systematically burned every bridge and poisoned every well they ever had access to. The social fallout was swift and absolute. I did not have to spend a single second defending my reputation or explaining my actions to anyone in my family. My reputation remained absolutely spotless and completely unquestioned. The silence they received from the family was not a sign of agreement with their lies. It was a collective sigh of relief from our entire extended circle. Everyone was simply glad that the financial leeches had finally been permanently severed from the host. I sat in my quiet apartment, feeling a deep and profound sense of peace. The shield was holding strong, and the truth had successfully protected my legacy without me having to speak a single defensive word. The swift and brutal reality of their financial collapse did not take months to materialize. It took less than 72 hours. The protective bubble I had funded for their entire adult lives popped with a definitive and echoing finality. I did not have to lift another finger or make a single phone call. I simply sat back in my quiet apartment and let the cold machinery of the real world process their staggering debts. Jacob was the first to feel the crushing weight of the anvil dropping. The automotive lender did not waste any time after Neil notified them of my withdrawal as a co-signer and the fraudulent behavior. On a rainy Thursday morning, Jacob walked out of his expensive leased apartment building, expecting to slide into his luxury sports car. Instead, he found an empty parking space and a faint oil stain on the concrete. The repossession team had arrived in the dead of night. They hooked up his pristine vehicle and towed it away to a holding lot. He had no legal standing to fight the repossession because he had been defaulting on his portion of the payments for months. His transportation, his status symbol, and his fake armor were stripped away before he even had his morning coffee. But the loss of the car was merely a paper cut compared to the amputation of his real estate dreams. Friday arrived exactly as he had predicted. It was the deadline for the final underwriting on his luxury penthouse condominium. Jacob marched into the bank office, desperately trying to secure a last-minute loan extension or find a predatory lender willing to take a massive risk on his terrible credit. He sat across from the mortgage officers, sweating through his tailored navy suit. They looked at his debt-to-income ratio, his recently repossessed vehicle, and the glaring absence of my $1.2 million safety net. They did not just deny his loan application, they laughed him out of the building. The deadline passed, and the seller officially terminated the contract. Just like that, Jacob permanently lost his $75,000 non-refundable deposit. The money he had desperately scraped together by maxing out his credit cards completely vanished into thin air. He had gambled his entire financial future on the absolute certainty that he could steal my life savings, and he lost everything. His corporate facade shattered completely. His creditors began calling his office, relentlessly demanding payment for the massive debts he could no longer hide. Natalie faced a very similar and entirely humiliating destruction. When the business day ended on Wednesday, the commercial eviction notice Neil had drafted went into full and immediate effect. Natalie arrived at her high-end boutique the following morning, carrying her designer coffee and expecting to open the doors for another day of playing pretend entrepreneur. Instead, she was greeted by a heavy iron padlock securing the front doors and an official legal notice plastered right across the front glass window. She could not get inside to retrieve her merchandise. The inventory she had carelessly purchased on credit was officially locked down to be liquidated against the 2 years of back rent she owed my holding company. Her entire fashion empire vanished in the blink of an eye. She spent the entire morning standing on the public sidewalk, crying hysterically, while her few employees realized they no longer had jobs, and her suppliers realized they were never going to get paid. She had no storefront, no inventory, and absolutely no income. Without my money flowing into their accounts, the heavy and terrifying reality of gravity took hold of my children. They could no longer afford the exorbitant rent on their luxury city apartments. They were both forced to break their leases and move out before formal eviction proceedings ruined their rental histories completely. Jacob packed his tailored suits into cardboard boxes and moved into a cramped studio apartment on the industrial side of the city. Natalie had to sell her designer handbags to a consignment shop just to afford the security deposit on a tiny basement unit shared with 2 roommates she barely knew. They had to face the terrifying prospect of finding actual employment without a customized safety net catching their falls. Jacob discovered that his inflated corporate resume meant absolutely nothing when background checks revealed his massive defaulted debts and his repossessed vehicle. He was forced to accept a grueling entry-level sales position, making cold calls in a crowded cubicle farm just to keep the collection agencies from garnishing his meager wages. He now takes a crowded public bus to work every single morning, staring out the window while wearing a cheap suit that does not fit him right anymore. Natalie learned that running a failed boutique with her father's money did not translate into executive experience. She spent weeks receiving rejection emails from fashion houses and marketing firms. With her bank accounts completely empty, she had to swallow her massive pride and accept a minimum wage job working the cash register at a massive retail clothing chain. She spends 8 hours a day on her feet folding cheap shirts and dealing with rude customers for barely enough money to buy groceries. I heard about their new circumstances through the grapevine of the city, but I never reached out to confirm the details. I did not need to. I knew the real world was a harsh and unforgiving teacher for people who had never learned the value of a hard-earned dollar. They were finally living the life they had mocked me for enduring. They were finally experiencing the exhaustion, the frustration, and the sheer panic of living paycheck to paycheck. I did not feel a single ounce of joy or vindictive pleasure watching them struggle. I did not celebrate their financial ruin. But I also did not feel a single drop of guilt. They had built their own prisons out of greed, entitlement, and sheer arrogance. I simply refused to be the one paying the rent on their cells anymore. The financial collapse was complete and absolute. They were finally forced to grow up and stand on their own 2 feet, and I was completely at peace knowing that their survival was no longer my responsibility. 6 weeks after I walked out of that sterile city apartment, I signed the closing papers on a completely new life. I purchased a modest but beautiful modern home nestled right on the edge of a quiet freshwater lake. It was a massive departure from the dusty, sprawling acres of the farm. There were no barns to repair and no heavy tractors to maintain. There were just large glass windows, polished wood floors, and a wide wooden deck that stretched out over the calm blue water. It was the perfect place for an old man to finally stop moving and just exist. The physical healing took time. For the first month, every deep breath and every sudden movement was a sharp reminder of the violence that took place in my kitchen. But eventually, the bone knitted itself back together. I stopped wearing the tight medical wrap around my torso. The sharp stabbing pain faded into a dull ache and then vanished entirely. Now I can stand on my deck and take massive deep breaths of the crisp lake air without a single flinch. My body healed exactly the way my mind did, through quiet distance and absolute stillness. I do not feel any triumphant joy about my current situation. I do not sit in my comfortable leather chair and gloat over the financial ruins of my children. There is no victory in realizing the boy you taught to ride a bicycle grew into a man who would gladly leave you penniless. There is no celebration in knowing the daughter you comforted through childhood nightmares now views you as a discarded stepping stone. The emotion that fills my days is a profound and melancholic peace. I mourn the family I thought I had, but I completely accept the reality of the strangers they actually became. The silence in my new home is beautiful. I do not wake up with a knot of anxiety in my stomach, wondering what new financial disaster Jacob has created. I do not dread the ringing of my phone, expecting another tearful, manipulative demand from Natalie. My phone rarely rings at all now, and when it does, it is usually my lawyer Neil Carter checking in. Neil calls me every few weeks to provide brief updates on the blind trust. The money from the farm sale is performing exactly as I intended. The agricultural charity has already utilized a portion of the funds to purchase brand new farming equipment for young families trying to work their own land. They are funding educational programs teaching the next generation how to respect the soil and build a sustainable, honest living. The fortune I built with my calloused hands is finally growing something truly beautiful. It is no longer feeding endless corporate greed or funding luxury vanity projects. It is planting real seeds for a better future. Knowing my legacy is helping hardworking people brings a warm, steady comfort to my heart. My daily routine is incredibly simple and entirely my own. I still wake up before the sun rises because 40 years of farming creates habits you cannot easily break. But I no longer rush out the door to beat the weather. I take my time. I brew a strong pot of black coffee and pour it into a ceramic mug. I walk out onto the wooden deck and sit in a comfortable chair, watching the morning mist roll slowly across the surface of the lake. I listen to the loons buzzing in the reeds and the gentle lap of water against the wooden pylons. Sometimes I take a small aluminum boat out onto the water and cast a fishing line into the deep green depths. I spend hours just floating under the open sky, unbothered by the demands of the world. I read books I purchased decades ago but never had the energy to open. I cook simple meals for myself and eat them while watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant shades of orange and purple. I sleep completely through the night without waking up in a cold sweat over unpaid loans or hidden debts. I am completely and utterly unburdened. I spent the vast majority of my adult life breaking my back to provide a comfortable existence for people who ultimately saw me as nothing more than a walking bank account. I let my late wife mask their extreme entitlement with secret financial bailouts. I allowed the toxic rot of greed to spread through the foundation of my family because I was too busy working the fields to see the truth. But I finally took a knife to the infection and cut it out completely. I reclaimed my autonomy on the exact day my son tried to physically break me. He managed to fracture a bone, but he completely failed to break my spirit. I look out over the vast expanse of the lake, feeling the gentle morning breeze brush against my face. I do not know what the rest of my years will bring. I do not know if Jacob or Natalie will ever truly understand the harsh lesson they were forced to learn. I do not know if the brutal reality of living paycheck to paycheck will ever strip away their staggering arrogance. That is their journey to walk and their burden to carry. My journey is right here by the water. My wealth is safely locked away where it can actually do some good in the world. My dignity is entirely intact. My life finally belongs to me and no one else. The most profound takeaway from these narratives is that true family is built on a foundation of mutual respect, not merely shared blood or financial obligation. When love becomes a transaction, it ceases to be love. It is a harsh reality to accept that the people we sacrifice the most for can sometimes become the ones who exploit us the worst. However, these stories powerfully remind us that setting firm boundaries is never an act of cruelty. It is an act of absolute self-preservation. You are never too old to reclaim your dignity, cut ties with toxicity, and demand the respect you inherently deserve. If you have ever had to set a difficult boundary with a loved one to protect your own peace, share how you found your strength in the comments below.